The wedding dress she wore was heavier than 6-year-old Isabel of France herself, each layer adorned with golden silk and jewels that seemed to weigh her down as she struggled to walk. Hundreds of flickering candles illuminated the Gothic windows of St. Paul's Cathedral, while the majestic sounds of the organ echoed through the stone halls. Nobles from two rival kingdoms, seated like silent sentinels, turned their gaze towards the child bride as she approached the altar. There, waiting to claim her as his queen, stood a 29-year-old man. In mere moments, you will uncover the chilling truth about Europe's youngest political victim, a truth that medieval chroniclers have worked for centuries to obscure. This story reveals what truly transpired behind the palace walls when children became mere pawns in the ruthless games of royalty. But even more shocking is the realization that this was not some barbaric practice from a distant and uncivilized past. Rather, it unfolded in the heart of London and France at the pinnacle of medieval civilization. What I am about to disclose will irrevocably alter your perception of how European royalty treated their own offspring. On November 9, 1389, the echoing halls of the Louvre Palace were filled not with the joyful cries of newborns but with the anguished screams of madness. King Charles VI of France, known to history as Charles the Mad, was experiencing another debilitating episode. Gripped by a delusion that he was made of glass and that any physical contact could shatter him into 1,000 pieces, he cowered in dark corners, fearing invisible enemies lurking within his own palace. Meanwhile, in another wing of the palace, Queen Isabella of Bavaria gave birth to her fourth daughter. As the midwives exchanged worried glances at the arrival of yet another girl, another mouth to feed, and another pawn to be groomed for political alliances, they named her Isabel. From the moment she took her first breath, Isabel was destined to be treated not as a child but as currency. Imagine, if you will, that while your concerns at the age of 6 revolved around learning to read or cultivating friendships, Isabel was being prepared to serve as a living treaty. Her toys weren't mere dolls, they were miniature courts where she practiced diplomatic ceremonies. Her bedtime stories were not fairy tales but rather lessons in the art of statecraft. To comprehend how this 6-year-old child came to be married to a man old enough to be her father, we must delve into the festering decay that lay at the heart of the French royal family. Charles VI had not always suffered from madness. At only 24 years old, a mental break occurred during a military campaign. In an instant, he transformed from a commanding leader into an unhinged adversary, attacking his own troops, convinced they were plotting against his life. His episodes manifested in waves, revealing him at times as the cultured king that France needed, only for him to suddenly strip naked or forget his own name in the throes of madness. The medical practices of the era, ranging from bloodletting to exorcisms, provided no remedy. France found itself under the rule of a deranged king, while opportunistic figures began to circle like vultures. Among them, Isabella of Bavaria, the king's wife, saw not tragedy in his madness but a golden opportunity for personal gain. With Charles VI's mental state deteriorating, each episode presented Isabella with a chance to seize more power, accumulate wealth, and take lovers while her husband cowered in his chambers. The chroniclers of the court, whose duty it was to elevate the royal image, couldn't hide their contempt for Isabella. One writer noted with disgust that she appeared to value her jewels above her children and preferred her lavish pleasures to the duties of motherhood. Reports emerged that she had at least 3 lovers, while the king struggled through his episodes, at times entertaining her suitors in close proximity to where Charles VI was restrained. This was the woman responsible for raising Isabel. This was her model of motherhood. The Louvre Palace, where Isabel spent her early years, was a treacherous maze of conspiracy and treason, where to factions the Armagnacs and the Burgundians battled for control over the Mad King. Attempts on personas' lives were commonplace, and poisoning was an ever-present fear. Noble children did not frolic in gardens, rather they played in fortified courtyards, always under the watch of guards ready to fend off any threats. Isabel learned to sense her father's impending madness long before she could read. She noticed his eyes darting nervously, the tremors in his hands, and the deep silence that signified it was time to flee, typically before the violence erupted. The first time she witnessed her father attempt to harm her mother, a moment when he was convinced that Isabel was a demon sent to steal his soul. She was only 4 years old. Yet there's a heartbreaking detail buried in the meticulous records of the French court's expenses, which historians prefer to overlook. In 1394, at just 5 years old, a record reveals that the royal treasury allocated funds for iron bars to be installed on Isabel's chamber windows, not for decorative purposes, nor to secure her against outside threats, but because a 5-year-old princess had attempted to, even at that tender age, she deemed death preferable to the life she was living. The trauma was merely a precursor to what awaited her. In 1395, a proposition from England arrived that would rectify many of France's political woes while imprisoning a little girl in a lifetime of despair. Richard II of England found himself desperate after the death of his first wife and of Bohemia, leaving him without heirs and allies. His nobles were restless, and his treasury lay empty after years of warfare with France. Opting for a swift resolution, the French council recognized the potential to trade nearly 3 decades of peace for a mere child, one who embodied their future hope and unrest. The negotiations took on an unsettling tone, resembling a shameful marketplace, as grown men in luxurious robes haggled over a 6-year-old girl. Even the English ambassadors initially recoiled at the prospect of marrying off such a young child, as it was customary for royal brides to be at least 12 years old, mature enough to survive childbirth. But the French negotiators had darkly persuasive counter-arguments. They argued that marrying Isabel young would allow Richard to mold her in accordance with his preferences, ensuring that she would grow up fully accustomed to English customs and his desires. In their words, she would become more completely his. Tragically, this act was described as state-sanctioned grooming. The English, wishing to inspect their potential bride, sent orders for Isabel to be paraded before them to ensure she met their expectations. They examined her teeth, her posture, her hair, even making her walk back and forth to ascertain her physical health. A lord in the delegation was overheard remarking on how she would ripen beautifully. She was just 6 years old. The final deal was reached in the summer of 1396. France would grant Richard II 800,000 livres, an unfathomable sum equivalent to nearly 2 years of English royal revenue, in exchange for Isabel and a 28-year truce, along with the return of French territories. However, it is the cruelest detail of the marriage contract that many modern historians overlook. It stipulated that while the marriage would not be consummated until Isabel reached an appropriate age, Richard would retain all other rights typically granted to a husband immediately. This included control over where she lived, her education, whom she could associate with, and even the right to share her bed, as was the custom for young brides to acclimate to their husbands. In one swift stroke, they signed away her childhood. When the news reached Isabel that she was to become Queen of England, she tearfully asked her governess, as recorded in private letters, "Will I be able to bring my dolls?" This poignant inquiry captures the essence of her plight, a little girl more focused on her toys than on the grim fate ahead of her. In preparation for the wedding, the French court threw themselves into a frenzy of elaborate plans. Seamstresses toiled day and night to create a trousseau suitable for a queen, 12 wedding dresses, 40 ceremonial gowns, and jewels that had belonged to 3 generations of French queens, all sized for a petite 6-year-old body. Isabella of Bavaria, for her part, took personal interest in the arrangements, showing more enthusiasm for her daughter's wedding than she had ever shown during Isabel's upbringing. This was her triumph, successfully trading her daughter for peace and profit, while the court poets penned verses glorifying her wisdom, obscuring the fate of the girl being sacrificed for political gain. In October 1396, the farewell ceremony at the Louvre was orchestrated as a magnificent spectacle of political theater. Charles VI, in one of his rare moments of lucidity, blessed his daughter, tears streaming down his face as he held her tightly, a grip so fierce that attendants had to pry his arms away. Witnesses recalled him whispering something into her ear that sent Isabel into inconsolable sobs. We'll never know what a mad king said to his 6-year-old daughter in their final moments together, but accounts reveal she cried for her father long after the palace faded from view. The 2-week journey from Paris to Calais was nothing short of torment for the frightened child, who clutched her favorite wooden doll, her fingers clawing at it until they bled. When the English delegation got ready to receive her in a tent city on the beach, the atmosphere resembled a festival with musicians and performers, but it felt like a cruel farce to Isabel. The moment of transfer was executed with precise choreography. French nobles brought Isabel to the center of a measured field where English nobles awaited. They exchanged words in Latin, words that meant nothing to her as transactions were finalized and gold changed hands. Just like that, she became property of England. What followed was a nightmare that would horrify any onlooker. Immediately after the handover, English officials separated Isabel from her French attendants, stripping away her familiar support system. Her governess, who had cared for her since birth, was sent back to France. The language in which she had been nurtured faded as she was surrounded by English women whom she could not understand. Even her little dog, a companion she had been promised would accompany her, was taken from her because Richard detested small dogs. Isabel was hurled into the unfamiliarity of a strange country, her sense of security shattered in mere hours. The journey from Calais to London blurred as she faced unrecognizable faces and alien languages, all while the festive atmosphere exaggerated her anxiety. Although the townspeople were ordered to celebrate their new queen, Isabel, exhausted and terrified, could only interpret the spectacle as foreboding. In her young mind, such extravagance could only herald death. Upon her arrival in London in November 1396, the city transformed for the occasion. Richard II had spared no expense, showering riches that he did not possess to both impress his subjects and intimidate his rivals. Westminster Palace was adorned with gold cloth, the Thames shimmered with decorated barges, and bell towers rang from dawn until midnight. St. Paul's Cathedral was transformed into a setting out of a fever dream, filled with candles and incense to an overwhelming degree, illuminated by the weight of grandeur. And at the epicenter of it all stood Richard II, an elegant figure in splendid robes worth fortunes, waiting to marry a mere child. Despite his polished demeanor, Richard's anxieties centered around his political machinations. Would this marriage afford him enough time to subdue his domestic adversaries? Would the French fulfill their financial obligations, and would his nobles accept a queen unable to produce heirs for at least 6 years to come? Yet the moral dilemma of marrying a child never seemed to cross his mind. As Isabel walked down the aisle, the crowd gasped not in admiration but in shock. She was so small that the ornate ceremonial robes trailed behind her, requiring 2 attendants to lift the train. The crown, crafted for her tiny head, slipped continuously, necessitating constant adjustments. Like a prisoner, Isabel was led down the aisle, her future already determined by men in the audience, all of whom watched with keen interest. When the Archbishop of Canterbury performed the ceremony, he knelt to reach her level, asking if she consented to the marriage. The reality was that Isabel could not answer her father's question. Terror had stolen her voice. An English lady-in-waiting had to prompt her, whispering encouragement until Isabel could repeat the words, "I will." With those 2 words, a mere child was sentenced to a lifetime of captivity. When the time came to exchange rings, Richard's hands enveloped Isabel's in a grasp that seemed overwhelming. Witnesses noted that she flinched at his touch. Despite being sized for a child, the ring had to be forced onto her delicate finger, eliciting a wince and a small cry of pain that echoed in the vast cathedral. Yet, in the midst of this grotesque display, Richard displayed a flicker of mercy. He placed a kiss on her forehead instead of her lips during the traditional kiss of peace. And then it was done. Isabella of France became Isabella of England, now queen consort, bound in marriage to a man who could have been her father. The audience cheered, bells rang, and coins were tossed to the less fortunate, all while a 6-year-old girl stood at the altar, tears streaming down her cheeks, struggling to comprehend why everyone around her was celebrating what she experienced as the worst day of her life. The wedding feast held at Westminster Hall was nothing short of extravagant, with over 2,000 guests indulging in sumptuous dishes fit for royalty, swans stuffed with peacock and boars' heads gilded with gold leaf. But Isabel sat at the high table, dwarfed by a chair adjusted to meet the adult height of her guests. She could neither eat nor participate. In fact, the Archbishop of York noted that she stared vacantly at a fixed point on the wall, as if her spirit had already fled, leaving behind a shell. However, the true horror was yet to come. The ritual associated with medieval marriage nights was public, though not in the grotesque manner some might imagine. Instead, the bedding ceremony itself was an act of social theater where the bride would be enrest by her maidens, blessed by priests, then led to bed, expected to embrace the groom, as their nuptials would then be considered complete. This was the dark reality of Isabel's world, a life stripped of innocence, wrapped in the glittering chains of royalty.